My name is David, and I used to work as an overnight orderly at St. Catherine's Hospital on the east side of town. It's an old hospital, built sometime in the 1950s, with that institutional architecture that makes everything feel cold and sterile no matter how much they try to modernize it. The main building is 8 floors, with 2 basement levels that house the morgue, storage, and the old kitchen that nobody uses anymore. I worked the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. The pay was better than anything else I could get with just a high school diploma, and I didn't mind the hours. I've always been a night owl anyway. My job was pretty straightforward. I'd transport patients between floors, deliver supplies to the nurses' stations, clean equipment, and handle any miscellaneous tasks that came up during the night. Most of it was just pushing beds and wheelchairs around, restocking supplies, that kind of thing. The hospital was always quieter at night, with just a skeleton crew of nurses, 1 or 2 doctors on call, and a handful of other support staff like me. I actually liked the peaceful atmosphere. Or at least I did, until what happened last October. This particular incident started on a Tuesday night, October 17th. I remember the date exactly because it was 2 days after my birthday. I clocked in at 11 p.m. like always, got my assignment sheet from the night supervisor, and started my rounds. Everything was normal for the first couple of hours. I delivered some clean linens to the 4th floor, transported a patient from the ER to a room on the 3rd floor, and restocked the supply closets on the surgical wing. Around 1:30 a.m., I got a call over the radio from one of the nurses on the 6th floor. She said they needed someone to go down to the basement storage room and bring up some 4 stands. We were always running low on equipment, and a lot of the older stuff was stored in the basement. I grabbed my keys and headed for the service elevator at the back of the building. The service elevator is this old, slow thing that stops at every floor, including both basement levels. It's loud and creaky, and the fluorescent light inside flickers constantly, but it's the only elevator that goes all the way down to B2. When I got to the basement level, the elevator doors opened with this metallic groan that echoed down the hallway. B2 is not a place where people spend much time. It's mainly just long corridors lined with storage rooms, old equipment, and the morgue at the far end. The lighting down there has always been poor, with long stretches of hallway between the overhead lights, creating these pockets of shadow that never quite go away. The air always feels heavier down there too, like the ventilation system doesn't reach that deep. I walked down the main corridor toward storage room 7, where they kept the medical equipment. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, and I could hear the building settling around me, all those creaks and groans that old buildings make. About halfway down the corridor, I heard something that made me stop walking. It was a voice, a woman's voice, very faint, coming from somewhere ahead of me. At first, I thought maybe one of the nurses had come down for something and was on her phone, but as I got closer, I realized the voice sounded wrong. It was singing, just this soft, wordless melody, like a lullaby. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The singing stopped immediately. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, just the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of water running through pipes somewhere in the walls. I shook it off and continued to the storage room. I unlocked the door, flipped on the light, and started gathering the 4 stands. The room was packed with old equipment, shelves full of supplies, and dusty boxes that probably hadn't been opened in years. I was loading the 3rd 4 stand onto my cart when I heard the singing again. This time it was closer. It sounded like it was right outside the storage room door. I walked over and looked out into the hallway. Nothing. The corridor was empty in both directions. The singing had stopped again. I stood there for a moment, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The basement had always been a little creepy, but I'd worked down there dozens of times and never experienced anything like this. I quickly finished loading the equipment and started pushing the cart back toward the elevator. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that someone was behind me. The hallway seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper. When I was about 20 feet from the elevator, I heard footsteps, not behind me, but ahead of me, coming from around the corner where the corridor turned toward the morgue. They were slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone wearing hard-soled shoes on the concrete floor. I stopped pushing the cart and called out again. "Hello? Who's down here?" No response. The footsteps continued, getting closer. I could hear them clearly now, echoing off the walls. Step, 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 slow and steady. And then, just as I was about to see who was coming around that corner, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I stood there, my heart pounding, staring at that corner. Nobody appeared. Nobody walked past. It was like whoever had been walking just vanished into thin air. I didn't wait around to figure it out. I grabbed the cart and pushed it as fast as I could to the elevator. I jabbed the call button repeatedly, and when the doors finally opened, I practically threw the cart inside and pressed the button for the 6th floor. As the doors were closing, I looked down the hallway one last time. Standing at the far end, near the morgue entrance, was a figure, a woman in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, the kind they wore back in the 50s or 60s. She was just standing there, facing my direction, completely still. The elevator doors closed before I could see anything else. When I got to the 6th floor, I delivered the equipment to the nurse's station. The nurse who had requested it, Linda, asked me if I was okay. She said I looked pale. I told her I was fine, just felt a little off. I didn't mention what I'd seen in the basement. I figured she'd think I was crazy or making it up. Linda was a no-nonsense type who'd worked at the hospital for 20 years, and I doubted she'd be sympathetic to ghost stories. I tried to put out of my mind and continued with my shift. Around 3 a.m., I was in the supply room on the 4th floor, restocking shelves, when I heard someone walk past in the hallway. I looked out and saw a woman in a nurse's uniform turning the corner at the end of the hall. For a second, my heart jumped because the uniform looked old-fashioned, like the one I'd seen in the basement. But when I walked to the corner and looked, it was just Jennifer, one of the regular night nurses, wearing the standard modern scrubs. I was starting to think I was just tired and imagining things. At 4 a.m., I got another call over the radio. This time it was from the supervisor, asking me to go to morgue in B2 to retrieve some paperwork that had been left there by mistake. The morgue, of all places. I considered refusing, making up some excuse, but I needed this job and I didn't want to look like I was scared to go in the basement. So I grabbed my keys and headed back down. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. When the doors opened on B2, the hallway looked exactly the same as before. Dim lighting, long shadows, that heavy feeling in the air. I stepped out and started walking toward the morgue, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridor. I kept my eyes forward, trying not to look at the dark spaces between the lights, trying not to think about the figure I'd seen earlier. The morgue entrance is at the very end of the corridor, through a set of double doors with small windows. As I approached, I could see that the lights were on inside, which was unusual. The morgue was almost never occupied at night, unless there had been a recent death, and I hadn't heard anything about that. I pushed open one of the doors and stepped inside. The morgue is a large room with white tile walls and a row of refrigerated compartments along one side where they keep the bodies. In the center of the room are 2 stainless steel examination tables, and along the other wall are cabinets and a desk where the paperwork is kept. The room was cold, much colder than the hallway, and it had that chemical smell that all morgues have. I walked over to the desk and started looking through the papers, trying to find what the supervisor had mentioned. That's when I heard it, a sound like metal scraping against metal. I turned around and saw that one of the refrigerated compartment doors was slowly sliding open. Not all the way, just a few inches, enough to see into the darkness inside. I stood there frozen, watching as the door continued to slide open, inch by inch. My rational brain was telling me that maybe the door hadn't been closed properly, that it was just gravity pulling it open. But my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. The door stopped moving when it was about halfway open. I could see inside now. There was a body in there, covered with a white sheet. I knew there must be bodies in those compartments. That's what they're for. But actually seeing one in the middle of the night, with the door open by itself, was a completely different experience. I grabbed the paperwork I'd been looking for and started backing toward the exit, keeping my eyes on that open compartment. As I reached the door, I heard the singing again, that same wordless lullaby I'd heard earlier. It was coming from inside the morgue, and it sounded like it was coming from the direction of that open compartment. I didn't wait to hear any more. I pushed through the double doors and ran. I ran down that hallway, my footsteps echoing wildly, not caring how it looked or what anyone would think. I ran to the elevator and hammered the call button until the doors opened. When I got back upstairs, I went straight to the supervisor's office and told her I'd retrieved the paperwork. She thanked me and asked if everything was all right. I said yes, everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. I was shaking, and I couldn't stop thinking about that open compartment door and the singing. I wanted to tell someone, but what would I say? That I heard singing in the morgue? That a door opened by itself? They'd think I was losing it. I somehow made it through the rest of my shift, though I jumped at every sound and avoided going anywhere near the service elevator. When 7 a.m. finally came and the day shift started arriving, I clocked out and went straight to my car. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. Maybe the singing was just pipes or the ventilation system making weird noises. Maybe the door in the morgue hadn't been closed properly. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't explain the figure I'd seen. That woman in the old-fashioned uniform standing at the end of the hallway. That wasn't sound or a door malfunction. That was something I'd seen with my own eyes. I went home and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the basement hallway. The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money and I didn't want to lose my job. I showed up at 11 p.m. and clocked in, hoping that the previous night had been a one-time thing. Some weird combination of circumstances that wouldn't repeat itself. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I did my rounds, delivered supplies, transported a patient. No singing, no footsteps, no figures in old uniforms. I started to relax a little. Around 2 a.m., I was pushing a wheelchair back to storage on the second floor when the elevator stopped between floors. This wasn't completely unusual. The elevators in the hospital were old, and sometimes they'd glitch and stop for a few seconds before continuing. But this time, it didn't continue. The elevator just sat there, suspended between the second and third floors. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I stood there in the dark, feeling my heart rate spike. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the emergency lights came on. They're these dim red lights that barely illuminate anything, casting everything in this eerie red glow. I pressed the alarm button on the elevator panel, and I could hear it ringing somewhere in the building. I tried the radio, but all I got was static. Then I heard it, that singing. It was in the elevator with me, coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty wheelchair and the red emergency lights. The singing continued, that same soft lullaby, and it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I backed into the corner of the elevator, pressing myself against the wall, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The temperature in the elevator started to drop. I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face. And then I saw her. She was standing next to the wheelchair, her form barely visible in the red light, the woman in the old-fashioned nurse's uniform. She was facing away from me, and she was the one singing. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching this apparition standing in the elevator with me. She slowly turned around, and I finally saw her face. Or rather, where her face should have been. There was nothing, just smooth skin where her features should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. But the singing continued, that lullaby filling the small space of the elevator. She started moving toward me, gliding more than walking, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, as if I could somehow push through it and escape. Just as she was about to reach me, the elevator lurched and the lights came back on. The normal fluorescent lights, bright and harsh. I blinked against the sudden brightness, and when my eyes adjusted, I was alone. The woman was gone. The singing had stopped. The elevator started moving again and came to stop on the third floor. The doors opened, and I practically fell out into the hallway. A nurse named Patricia was standing there, waiting for the elevator. She looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay. I must have looked terrible because she actually took a step toward me, like she thought I might collapse. I told her I was fine, that I had just gotten startled when the elevator stopped. She said the power had flickered throughout the hospital and several elevators had stopped temporarily. She helped me get the wheelchair back to storage, and I thanked her and said I needed to go splash some water on my face. I went to the nearest bathroom and stood at the sink, staring at myself in the mirror. I looked pale and shaken. I kept replaying what I'd seen in the elevator, tried to convince myself it hadn't been real, but I knew what I'd experienced. That woman, that thing, had been in the elevator with me. I'd seen her. I'd heard her. I'd felt the temperature drop. It had been real. I made it through the rest of that shift, but I spent most of it in the break room, avoiding any situation where I might be alone or have to go to the basement. When my shift ended, I went straight to the supervisor and told her I was putting in my 2 weeks' notice. She seemed surprised and asked if everything was okay. I said I'd gotten a better job offer, which was a lie. I didn't have another job lined up. I just knew I couldn't work there anymore, but I still had 2 more weeks of shifts to work. That first night after giving my notice was the worst one yet. I was doing a supply run on the 7th floor around 3 a.m. when I heard the singing again. This time it wasn't faint or distant. It was loud and clear, coming from one of the patient rooms. Room 717. I checked my assignment sheet. Room 717 was supposed to be empty, scheduled for cleaning the next day. I stood outside the door, listening. The singing was definitely coming from inside. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and looked in. The room was dark, but I could see a figure sitting in the chair by the window. A woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. She was facing the window, and she was singing that lullaby. As I stood there in the doorway, she slowly turned to look at me. Even in the darkness, I could see that smooth, featureless face. I closed the door immediately and backed away. I pulled out my radio and called for security, telling them there was someone in room 717 who shouldn't be there. 2 security guards arrived within minutes and went into the room. They came out a moment later and told me the room was empty. They checked everywhere, including the bathroom and the closet. Nobody was there. They asked me if I was sure I'd seen someone. I said I must have been mistaken, that the darkness had played tricks on my eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw her 4 more times, always in different locations. Once in the stairwell between the 4th and 5th floors. Once in the empty cafeteria at 4 a.m. Once standing at the end of a hallway on the 2nd floor. And once in the basement, in the same spot where I'd first seen her, near the morgue entrance. Every time, she was just standing there, facing me, with that blank, featureless face. And every time, she'd be gone within seconds, vanishing like she'd never been there at all. I started asking other staff members if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the hospital. Most of them just laughed it off or gave me weird looks. But one of the older janitors, a guy named Tom who'd worked there for 30 years, pulled me aside one night during my last week. He told me that the hospital was built on the site of an old nurses' dormitory that had burned down in 1952. 7 nurses had died in that fire, trapped on the upper floors. He said that over the years, there had been dozens of reports of strange occurrences in the hospital. Footsteps in empty hallways, voices when nobody was around, equipment moving on its own. And several people had reported seeing a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, always on the night shift, always in the basement or on the upper floors where the fire had been worst. He told me that most people who saw her ended up quitting within a month. He said the hospital administration knew about the stories, but they didn't acknowledge them because they didn't want to scare away staff or patients. He also said that he'd seen her once, about 10 years ago, standing in the morgue. He'd never gone back down to the basement alone after that. My last shift was on a Saturday night. I came in at 11 p.m., determined to just keep my head down and make it through the night without incident. For most of the shift, I stayed on the main floors, avoiding the basement and the upper floors as much as possible. But around 5 a.m., I got a call to transport a patient from the ER to the ICU on the 5th floor. It was a routine transport, something I'd done hundreds of times. I was wheeling the patient's bed into the elevator when I felt it. That presence, that feeling of being watched. I looked over my shoulder and saw her standing at the end of the hallway, near the ER entrance, the woman in the old uniform. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others with her, 6 other women, all in the same old-fashioned uniforms, all with the same featureless faces. They were just standing there, lined up, watching me. The elevator doors started to close, and I kept my eyes on those figures until the doors blocked them from view. When I got to the 5th floor and delivered the patient, I checked my watch. It was 5:47 a.m., less than 15 minutes left of my shift. I went back down to the 1st floor, stayed in the break room until 7 a.m., then clocked out for the last time. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just left. It's been 8 months since I quit St. Catherine's Hospital. I work at a grocery store now. Daytime hours, lots of people around. I sleep better knowing I'll never have to go back to that place. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those women, the nurses who died in that fire in 1952. What happened to them that keeps them trapped in that building? Why do they appear to certain people on the night shift? What were they trying to tell me? I don't know the answers to those questions, and honestly, I don't want to know. I'm just grateful that I got out when I did. But I feel sorry for whoever took my position. I hope they're braver than I was. Or maybe I hope they never see what I saw. Because once you see something like that, something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist, it changes you. You start questioning everything. You start wondering what else is out there that we can't see or understand. All I know is that I'll never work a night shift again. Not at a hospital. Not anywhere. Some things are meant to stay in the darkness, and I don't ever want to meet them again. I'm Tyler. Until about 4 months ago, I worked the overnight shift at a gas station off Highway 62, about 15 miles outside of town. It was one of those isolated places that gets most of its business from truckers and people traveling between cities. During the day, it was busy enough, but at night, you'd be lucky to see a dozen customers during an entire shift. The pay was minimum wage, but they gave me an extra $1 an hour for working the graveyard shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. The gas station itself was pretty standard. For pumps outside, a small convenience store inside with the usual stuff: snacks, drinks, cigarettes, lottery tickets. There was a bathroom around the back of the building that I had to check and clean every couple of hours. The whole place had this rundown feel to it, like it had been there since the 70s and nobody had bothered to update anything except the register system and the credit card readers. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly. Half the signs were faded or broken, and the pavement outside was cracked and full of potholes. My boss, Gary, was this older guy who owned 3 gas stations in the area. He rarely showed up at this location, mostly communicated through text messages, and didn't really care what I did as long as the money balanced at the end of my shift and I didn't leave the store unattended. Most nights, I'd just sit behind the counter, watch videos on my phone, maybe read a book, and ring up the occasional customer. It was boring work, but it was easy, and I didn't have to deal with many people. This all happened starting about 6 months ago, in early April. It was a Thursday night, and I clocked in at 10 p.m. like usual. The evening shift guy, Carlos, gave me the rundown, which was basically just telling me how much was in the register and mentioning that the bathroom door was sticking again. He left, and I settled in for what I expected to be another quiet, uneventful night. Around 11:30 p.m., a car pulled up to pump 3. It was an older model sedan, dark green, pretty beat up looking. A guy got out and started pumping gas, and I watched him on the security monitor behind the counter. He was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and he had this nervous energy about him. Kept looking around like he was expecting someone to show up. When he finished pumping, he came inside to pay. He was probably in his 40s, thin, with greasy hair pulled back in a ponytail. He had these intense eyes that kept darting around the store, never focusing on anything for more than a second. He paid for his gas in cash, exact change, and then asked if we had a bathroom. I told him it was around back and gave him the key. He took it and left without saying anything else. About 10 minutes went by, and he hadn't come back with the key. I was starting to get annoyed because I couldn't lock up the bathroom without it, and I didn't want Gary giving me crap about losing keys. I walked outside and around to the back of the building where the bathroom was located. The door was standing open and the light was on inside, but the guy wasn't there. The bathroom was empty. The key was sitting on the sink. I looked around the back of the building. His car was still at pump 3, but there was no sign of him. I walked around to the front and checked the store. He wasn't there either. I went back outside and looked at his car more carefully. The driver's door was hanging open and the keys were in the ignition. I could hear the little dinging sound the car makes when the keys are left in and the door's open, but the guy was just gone. Stood there for a few minutes, feeling increasingly weirded out. Where could he have gone? There was nothing around the gas station except empty highway in both directions and a field of scrub brush behind the building. I called out a few times, but nobody answered. Finally, I went back inside and called Gary. I told him what happened, and he said to wait 30 minutes, and if the guy didn't come back, to call the non-emergency police line and report an abandoned vehicle. I waited behind the counter, watching the security cameras, but the guy never reappeared. After 30 minutes, I called the police. A deputy showed up about 20 minutes later and took a report. He ran the plates on the car and said it was registered to someone with an address about 40 miles away. He tried calling the registered owner, but got no answer. He said he'd have the car towed and they'd follow up on it. He asked me if the guy had said anything unusual or if he'd seemed intoxicated or high. I said he just seemed nervous. Nothing else stood out. The deputy left, and a tow truck came about an hour later to take the car away. After that, the rest of my shift was quiet. But I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. Where had he gone? Why had he left his car with the keys in it? It didn't make any sense. The next night when I came in for my shift, I mentioned it to Carlos, and he said that weird stuff happened on Highway 62 all the time. People breaking down in strange ways, hitchhikers appearing and disappearing, that kind of thing. He said it was probably just a guy having some kind of mental health crisis, or maybe running from something. I tried to forget about it, but 3 nights later, something happened that made it impossible to dismiss. It was Sunday night, around 1 a.m., and I was doing a bathroom check. When I walked around the back of the building, I saw someone standing near the edge of the parking lot, right where the asphalt meets the scrub brush. It was dark back there. The light from the building only reached so far, but I could make out the silhouette of a man. He was just standing there, facing the building, not moving. I called out, "Hey, can I help you with something?" He didn't respond, didn't move. I took a few steps closer, and that's when I realized it was the same guy. The guy from Thursday night who had vanished. He was wearing the same clothes, the same dark jacket and jeans. My heart started pounding. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it in his direction. The light hit him, and I could see his face clearly. It was definitely the same guy, but something was wrong. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and his eyes were just staring straight ahead, not blinking, not reacting to the light. He looked like a mannequin, completely frozen in place. I took another step closer and said, "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" That's when he moved, but he didn't turn toward me or acknowledge me in any way. Instead, he just turned 90 degrees, like he was on a pivot, and started walking into the scrub brush. Not a normal walk, more like a glide. His feet were moving, but it didn't look natural. I watched him disappear into the darkness, the brush swallowing him up, and then there was nothing. Just the sound of the highway in the distance and the buzz of the fluorescent lights. I immediately went back inside and locked the door. I called the police again and told them what I'd seen. The same deputy from before came out, and I explained everything. He seemed skeptical, but agreed to take a look around. He walked the perimeter of the property with his flashlight, checked the brush behind the building, but he didn't find anyone. He told me that it was possible the guy was homeless and camping out in the area, and that I should call immediately if I saw him again. After the deputy left, I sat behind the counter for the rest of my shift, watching security cameras. I kept looking at the monitor that showed the back of the building, half expecting to see that figure appear again, but the night passed without any further incidents. When 6 a.m. came and the morning shift girl arrived, I told her everything that had happened. She looked concerned and said I should talk to Gary about installing more lights around the back of the building. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to think that maybe that had been the end of it. Maybe the guy really was just some homeless person passing through, and I just happened to see him twice. But then, exactly a week after the first time he'd appeared at the back of the building, I saw him again. Same time, around 1 a.m., same spot, just standing there at the edge of the parking lot. This time, I didn't go outside. I just watched him through the window. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, completely motionless, and then he did that same mechanical turn and walked off into the brush. I called the police, but by the time a deputy arrived, he was long gone. The deputy suggested I might want to consider requesting a transfer to another location or finding a different job if I felt unsafe. He said there wasn't much they could do unless the guy actually did something threatening or illegal. The appearances started becoming regular. Every Sunday night, around 1 a.m., he'd be there, always in the same spot, always standing motionless for a few minutes before walking off into the brush. I stopped calling the police because there was no point. They couldn't catch someone who vanished into the darkness before they arrived, and they were starting to treat me like I was crying wolf or making things up for attention. I started dreading Sunday nights. I'd spend the entire shift on edge, watching the clock, knowing that around 1 a.m., I'd look out the back window and see him standing there. But it got worse. After about 3 weeks of the Sunday appearances, he started showing up on other nights too. Tuesday nights, Thursday nights, always around 1 a.m., always the same behavior. And then other customers started mentioning him. A trucker came in one night around 2 a.m. and asked me if I'd seen a guy standing out by the edge of the parking lot. He said he'd pulled in to get gas and had seen someone just standing there in the dark, staring at his truck. When he'd finished pumping and looked again, the person was gone. A couple that stopped for snacks around midnight mentioned seeing someone standing near the brush when they pulled in, but when they came out of the store, the person had disappeared. I started documenting everything. I wrote down every appearance, noting the exact time, what he was wearing, how long he stood there. I took photos when I could, but they never came out clear. The distance and the lighting made it impossible to get a good shot. Just blurry images that could have been anyone or anything. I showed the photos to Gary, and he told me to stop being paranoid and to focus on my job. Then, about 2 months after all of this started, something changed. It was a Wednesday night, and I was restocking the cigarette shelf behind the counter around midnight. I had my back to the front door, and I heard the bell chime, indicating someone had come in. I called out, "Be with you in a sec," and finished what I was doing. When I turned around to greet the customer, my blood ran cold. It was him, the guy from the car, the guy who'd been appearing in the parking lot. He was standing just inside the door, staring at me with those blank, unblinking eyes. He looked exactly the same as the first night I'd seen him, wearing the same clothes, the same dark jacket. But up close, in the bright lights of the store, I could see that something was very wrong. His skin had that gray, waxy quality you see on corpses. His lips were slightly blue, and his eyes, while they were pointed in my direction, seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. I stood there frozen, unable to speak or move. He didn't say anything either. He just stood there, staring. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, he turned that same mechanical way he always did and walked back out the door. I watched through the window as he crossed the parking lot, walked past the pumps, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. I immediately grabbed my phone and called 911. I told them that the man who'd abandoned his vehicle at the gas station 2 months ago had just come into the store. I gave them a description, told them which direction he'd walked. They said they'd send someone out right away. 2 deputies arrived within 15 minutes and searched the entire area. They didn't find anyone. One of the deputies, a different guy than I'd dealt with before, pulled me aside and asked me some questions. He wanted to know if I was sure it was the same person from 2 months ago. I said I was absolutely certain. He looked uncomfortable and then asked me if I'd been drinking or using any drugs. I told him no, I was completely sober. He said that the owner of the vehicle that had been abandoned had been found dead 3 days after the car was towed. The guy had been found in his apartment, dead for at least a week before that, meaning he'd been dead before the car had even shown up at the gas station. I felt like I was going to be sick. I asked him if he was sure, if there was any possibility it had been someone else using the guy's car. He said they were certain. The death had been investigated because of the circumstances, and they confirmed through dental records and other means that it was definitely the registered owner of the vehicle. The cause of death was undetermined, but there were no signs of foul play. After the deputies left, I sat behind the counter, trying to process what I'd just been told. The guy I'd seen had been dead. Dead before his car even showed up at the gas station. Dead before I'd seen him walk to the bathroom. Dead before I'd watched him standing in the parking lot week after week. I was seeing a dead man, a ghost, something that shouldn't exist. I wanted to quit right then and there, but I was alone and couldn't leave the store unattended. I had to make it through the rest of my shift. I spent the remaining hours with every light in the store turned on, sitting behind the counter with my back to the wall, watching both the front door and the security monitors. Every shadow, every movement outside made my heart race. But he didn't appear again that night. The next morning, I told Gary I was done. I explained everything, including what the deputy had told me about the man being dead. Gary didn't believe me. He said I was probably just stressed and needed a few days off. He refused to accept my resignation and told me to take the rest of the week off and come back Monday with a better attitude. I told him I wasn't coming back at all, and I walked out, but I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to know more. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find information about the man who died. I found his obituary online. His name was Daniel Pritchard, 43 years old. The obituary didn't mention how he died, just that he'd passed away unexpectedly and was survived by a sister in another state. There was no funeral information, no photo, nothing that gave me any clues about who he was or why he'd appeared at the gas station. I drove back out to the gas station one afternoon, during the day when I knew someone else would be working. I talked to Carlos, asked him if anything strange had happened since I'd left. He said no, everything had been normal. No weird customers, no figures in the parking lot. But then he mentioned something that made my skin crawl. He said that about 3 years ago, before I'd started working there had been an accident on Highway 62 right near the gas station. A car had run off the road and hit a tree, and the driver had been killed. Carlos said that for months after that, people had reported seeing someone walking along the highway at night near that spot, but when they'd stop to help, the person would vanish. I asked him if he remembered what kind of car it was. He thought for a moment and said he thought it had been a dark green sedan, the same kind of car Daniel Pritchard had been driving. I felt sick. I asked him if he knew what had happened to the person who died in that accident, and he said he didn't know the details, just that it had been investigated and ruled an accident. The driver had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel. I went to the library and searched through old newspaper archives. I found an article about the accident from 3 years ago. The driver had been identified as Michael Chun, 37. The article said he'd been driving home late at night when his car had left the road and struck a tree. He'd been pronounced dead at the scene. There was a photo of the article, and when I saw it, my hand started shaking. It wasn't the same man. Michael Chun looked nothing like Daniel Pritchard. So there were 2 dead men connected to that stretch of highway. Maybe more. I started looking for other accidents, other deaths in that area. I found for more over the past decade, all single-vehicle accidents, all late at night, all with drivers who'd apparently lost control and gone off the road. Different people, different circumstances, but all dead on that same stretch of Highway 62 near the gas station. I don't work nights anymore. I got a job at a call center, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. But I still think about Daniel Pritchard and that gas station. I think about him standing in the parking lot, watching the building with those dead eyes. I think about the way he moved, that unnatural mechanical movement. And I think about the other people who died on that highway. Are they out there too? Are they walking along the road at night, appearing and disappearing, trapped in some kind of loop they can't escape from? I don't know the answers. I don't know if I want to know. All I know is that stretch of highway is cursed or haunted or something worse than either of those things. People die there, and then they don't stay dead. They come back, stuck in the last moments or hours of their lives, replaying them over and over. And that gas station sits right in the middle of it all, a beacon in the darkness where these lost souls appear, looking for something they'll never find. I drive a different route now. When I have to go anywhere at night, I avoid Highway 62 completely. And I never, ever stop at gas stations that are isolated or far from town. Because I know what can be waiting there in the dark. I've seen it. And once you've seen something like that, you can never unsee it. It changes the way you look at the world. It makes you realize that there are things out there we don't understand. Things that exist in the spaces between life and death. Things that won't let go even when they should. Gary texted me a few weeks after I quit. He said they'd hired a new overnight person and that things were going fine. But then, about a month ago, I got another text from him. He said the new guy had quit after 2 weeks. Said he kept seeing someone standing in the parking lot late at night, and it was freaking him out. Gary asked if I'd be willing to come back. Said he'd give me a raise. I didn't even respond. That gas station can keep its ghosts. I'm done with the night shift. I'm done with isolated places where strange things happen, and nobody believes you when you try to tell them what you've seen. I'm done with dead men who don't know they're dead, standing in parking lots, staring at buildings, caught in some endless loop they can't escape from. Someone else can deal with it. Not me. Never again. My name is James, and I used to work the night shift at an industrial plastics factory on the outskirts of town. The factory is a huge facility, about 200,000 square feet, with multiple production lines, storage areas, and shipping docks. It's been in operation since the 1970s, making everything from plastic containers to automotive parts. The building is old and showing its age, with poor lighting in many areas, constant mechanical noises, and that particular smell that all old factories have, a mix of chemicals, machine oil, and decades of accumulated dust. I worked as a quality control inspector on the night shift, which ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 days a week. My job was to walk to the factory floor, check the products coming off each production line, test them against quality standards, and document any defects or issues. The night shift ran with a skeleton crew compared to the day shift, where there might be 50 or 60 people during the day. At night, there were maybe 15 of us total, spread out across this massive facility. Sometimes you could go an hour without seeing another person. The pay was good, better than anything else I could get with just a high school diploma and a couple years of community college. The work itself wasn't hard, just tedious and lonely. I'd walk the same routes to the factory floor, checking the same machines, filling out the same reports. Most nights, I'd have my headphones in, listening to podcasts or music to pass the time. The factory was loud enough that nobody could hear what you were listening to anyway, with all the machines running, the conveyor belts moving, the ventilation system humming. This all started happening about 7 months ago, in March. I'd been working at the factory for about 2 years at that point, so I was familiar with every corner of the place. I knew which machines acted up, which areas had the worst lighting, which sections were the coldest. The factory didn't have the best maintenance, and there were always little problems. Flickering lights, machines that made weird noises, doors that didn't close properly. You got used to it after a while. On this particular night, a Friday, I was doing my regular rounds around midnight. I was on the west side of the factory, checking the injection molding machines on production line 7. This was one of the older sections of the building, with high ceilings supported by steel beams and inadequate lighting that left pools of shadow between the machines. I was inspecting a batch of plastic containers when I heard something that made me pause. It was a voice, a woman's voice, calling out something I couldn't quite make out over the noise of the machinery. I pulled out my headphones and listened. There it was again. Someone was calling for help. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the production area, near the storage section. I grabbed my radio and called it in to the shift supervisor, Mike, telling him I heard someone calling for help and I was going to check it out. He acknowledged and said he'd send someone else over back me up. I walked toward the back of the area, past the rows of machines and stacked pallets. The voice was getting clearer as I got closer. It was definitely a woman, and she was saying, "Help me, please. Somebody help me." My heart was pounding. The factory was a dangerous place with lots of heavy machinery, and if someone had gotten hurt or trapped somewhere, every second counted. I reached the storage area, a large space filled with floor-to-ceiling shelving units loaded with raw materials, molds, and finished products. The lighting back there was even worse than on the production floor, just a few overhead bulbs that barely illuminated anything. I called out, "Where are you? Keep talking so I can find you." The voice responded, "I'm here. Please help me. I'm stuck." It sounded like it was coming from one of the aisles between the shelving units. I started down the aisle, using my flashlight to see better. The voice was getting louder, more desperate. "Please help me. I can't get out." I was moving as fast as I could, checking behind the shelves, looking for whoever was calling out. But as I got deeper into the storage area, something started to feel wrong. The voice wasn't changing in volume or direction the way it should as I moved. It was staying at the same level, the same distance, like it was moving away from me as I approached. I stopped walking and stood still, listening carefully. The voice continued, "Help me, please. Somebody help me." The exact same words, in the exact same tone, with the exact same rhythm, like a recording playing on a loop. I felt a chill run down my spine. I called out again, "Where exactly are you? Can you see me?" The voice responded, but it wasn't answering my question. It just repeated, "I'm here. Please help me. I'm stuck." That's when Mike and another guy, Derek, arrived. They'd heard my call on the radio and come to help. I told them what I'd been hearing, and they listened. The voice was still there, still repeating the same phrases. Mike looked concerned and pulled out his radio, calling for everyone on the night shift to report their location. Everyone checked in. All 15 people working that night were accounted for. Nobody was missing. Nobody was stuck anywhere. But the voice continued. We split up and searched the entire storage area, checking every aisle, every corner, even climbing up to check the upper shelves. We didn't find anyone. Mike radioed the front office and had them check if anyone else was in the building. Maybe someone from management or maintenance who'd stayed late. Nobody else was there. The three of us stood in the middle of the storage area, listening to this disembodied voice calling for help, and none of us could figure out where it was coming from. Derek suggested it might be coming from outside, somehow carrying in through a ventilation shaft or something. We went to the exterior door at the back of the storage area and stepped outside. The voice stopped as soon as we were outside. We could hear the sounds of the factory behind us, traffic in the distance, but no voice calling for help. We went back inside, and within seconds there was again, "Help me, please, somebody help me." Mike decided to call it in to management. He got the facility manager on the phone and explained what was happening. The manager said to document it and keep working, and he'd come in early the next morning to investigate. In the meantime, we were supposed to avoid the storage area unless absolutely necessary. Mike assigned Derek to stay with me for the rest of the shift, so I wouldn't be alone if something else happened. For the rest of that night, we could hear the voice intermittently throughout the factory. It would stop for a while, then start up again. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes distant. It always said the same things. "Help me, please. Somebody help me," and "I'm here. Please help me. I'm stuck." By the end of the shift, everyone on the night crew was unnerved. We all heard it at various points during the night, coming from different parts of the factory. The next day, the facility manager brought in some technicians to check the PA system, thinking maybe there was some kind of malfunction causing the voice to play. They didn't find anything wrong. He also had maintenance check all the ventilation systems, thinking maybe sound was carrying from somewhere else in the building or from outside. Nothing explained it. The voice had been real. Everyone on the night shift had heard it, but there was no source, no explanation. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The voice came back the next Friday night. Same time, around midnight. Same location, starting in the storage area on the west side. And it came back every Friday night after that. Always around midnight. Always the same voice saying the same things. The factory management eventually stopped trying to figure it out. They just told us to ignore it and continue working. Most of the night shift crew got used to it after a few weeks, treating it like just another quirk of the old building. But I couldn't ignore it. Every Friday night, I'd hear that voice calling for help, and it made my skin crawl. Who was it? What had happened to make their voice echo through the factory like that? Was it a recording somehow playing without a source? Or was it something else? Something supernatural? I started asking some of the older employees who'd worked there for decades if they'd ever heard anything like it before. One of the maintenance guys, a man named Robert who'd been at the factory for 30 years, told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that back in 1989, a woman who worked the night shift had disappeared from the factory. She'd been seen at the beginning of her shift, clocked in, started her work, and then sometime during the night, she'd vanished. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her purse was still in her locker, but she was just gone. The police had investigated, searched the entire facility, questioned everyone who'd been working that night, but they never found any trace of her. Her name was Linda Morrison, and she'd been a quality control inspector, the same position I had. Robert said that for months after her disappearance, people reported hearing strange sounds in the factory at night, footsteps in empty areas, doors opening and closing on their own. And a few people claimed they'd heard a woman's voice calling out, though management had dismissed those reports as stress and imagination. Eventually, the report stopped, and Linda Morrison became just another unsolved missing person case. I looked up her case online. There wasn't much information, just a few old newspaper articles about her disappearance. She'd been 32 years old, single, no known problems in her personal life. She'd simply vanished in the factory in the middle of her shift, and nobody had ever figured out what happened to her. The case had gone cold decades ago. After learning about Linda Morrison, I couldn't hear that voice the same way. Every Friday night when it started calling for help, I wondered if it was her. If somehow her voice had been trapped in that factory, replaying her last moments, calling out for help that never came. I started paying closer attention to the voice, trying to hear any details that might confirm it was her. But it was always the same few phrases. Never anything specific, never anything that gave me any real answers. Then, about 3 months after the voice had first appeared, something else started happening. People started reporting seeing someone in the factory at night. A woman. walking through production areas, always alone, always moving between the machines and the storage areas. She'd be there for a second, visible in your peripheral vision, and then when you turn to look directly at her, she'd be gone. Different people saw her on different nights, always described the same thing. A woman with dark hair, wearing what looked like work clothes from the 80s or 90s, walking through the factory like she was heading somewhere specific. I saw her for the first time on a Wednesday night in June. I was inspecting products on line 4, and I saw someone walk past at the end of the aisle between machines. Just a quick glimpse, but enough to see it was a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a factory shirt. I called out, asking if she needed help with anything, but got no response. I walked to the end of the aisle, and she was gone. I checked my radio to see who else was working in that area, but according to check-in, I was the only person on that side of the factory at that moment. Over the next few weeks, I saw her multiple times, always just glimpses, never a clear view. She'd be at the end of an aisle, or walking past a doorway, or standing near a machine, always just at the edge of my vision. And whenever I tried to approach her or get a better look, she'd be gone. Other people on the night shift were experiencing the same thing. We'd talk about it during breaks, comparing notes, trying to figure out if we were all seeing the same person. Mike, the shift supervisor, finally called a meeting one night to address it. He said that management was aware of the reports and that they'd installed additional security cameras in the areas where people were seeing this figure. He said if anyone saw her again, we should immediately radio in the location, and they'd check the camera footage. It seemed like a reasonable plan. The next time I saw her was on a Friday night in July. I was in the storage area, the same place where I'd first heard the voice. I was checking inventory, and I saw her standing at the end of one of the aisles, about 30 feet away. For the first time, I had a clear view of her. She was facing away from me, looking at the shelves, and I could see her dark hair, her factory shirt with a name tag I couldn't read from that distance, her jeans and work boots. I grabbed my radio and called it in, giving the exact location. Mike responded and said he was checking the cameras. I kept watching her, not wanting to lose sight of her this time. She stood there for maybe 15 seconds, not moving, and then she started walking. She walked down the aisle, moving deeper into the storage area, and I followed, keeping a safe distance but trying to keep her in sight. She turned a corner, and I rushed to catch up, but when I reached the corner and looked down the next aisle, she was gone, just vanished. Mike's voice came over the radio. He said he'd reviewed the footage from the cameras in the storage area, and there was no one there. The cameras showed me standing in the aisle, looking at nothing, then walking around the corner, but they didn't show anyone else. I was the only person visible on the cameras, yet I knew what I'd seen. She had been there, as real and solid as anything else in that factory. After that incident, Mike pulled me aside at the end of the shift. He seemed concerned and asked me if I was doing okay, if I was getting enough sleep, if I was under any unusual stress. I told him I was fine, that I knew what I'd seen, and that other people were seeing the same thing. He said he believed that I believed I'd seen something, but the cameras didn't lie, and there was no one else in the factory. He suggested I take a few days off, get some rest, and come back with a fresh perspective. I didn't want to take time off. I needed the money, and I didn't want management to think I was unreliable or having some kind of breakdown. But Mike insisted, said it was mandatory, and that I'd be paid for the time off. So I took 5 days off, stayed home, tried to clear my head. I spent a lot of that time researching Linda Morrison, looking for any information I could find about her disappearance. I found an old interview with her sister in a newspaper archive. The sister said that Linda had called her the night she disappeared. During her break around 2 a.m., Linda had told her that something weird was happening at the factory, that she kept hearing strange noises and seeing things moving in her peripheral vision. She'd said she was feeling unsettled and was thinking about leaving early. That was the last time anyone heard from her. When I came back to work the following week, I was determined to figure out what was really going on. I started documenting everything. Every time I heard the voice, every time I saw the figure, I wrote down the exact time, location, and circumstances. I noted when other people reported similar experiences. I started to see a pattern. The voice always started around midnight on Friday nights, and the figure appeared most frequently in the west side of the factory, particularly in and around the storage area. I also started paying attention to the structure of the factory itself. The west side was the oldest part of the building, dating back to the original construction in the 1970s. There had been expansions and renovations over the years, but that original section had remained largely unchanged. I got access to the old building plans and blueprints, and I noticed something interesting. There was a storage closet marked on the old plans that didn't exist anymore. According to current layout, that space should have been part of the main storage area. But when I compared the measurements, something was off. I took a measuring tape and physically measured the storage area. I walked the length of several aisles, marking down the distances, and when I compared them to what the current blueprints showed, there was a discrepancy. About 8 feet of space was unaccounted for. There was a section of the wall in the storage area that should have had an opening based on the old blueprints, but it was just a solid wall covered in the same industrial paneling as the rest of the area. I showed my findings to Mike, and he seemed skeptical but agreed to look into it. He contacted the facility manager, and after some back and forth with corporate and legal, they decided to have maintenance investigate. They brought in some workers to remove the paneling from that section of wall. When they did, they found that behind the paneling was a doorway that had been walled up and covered over. Behind the wall, they found a small storage closet about 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. And inside the closet, they found skeletal remains, human remains. The police were called immediately, and the factory was shut down for 2 days while they investigated. The remains were identified through dental records as Linda Morrison, the woman who had disappeared in 1989. The police investigation determined that she died from a head injury, likely from falling, and hitting her head on the metal shelving in the closet. They theorized that she'd gone into the closet to retrieve something. The door had closed and locked behind her. It was an old door with a faulty lock mechanism, and she'd been unable to get out. She called for help, but in a noisy factory in the middle of the night with so few workers, nobody had heard her. She'd eventually tried to force the door open, fallen, hit her head, and died from the injury. At some point after her death, the factory had undergone a minor renovation. Someone, probably not knowing there was a body in the closet, had decided to wall up that section to create more uninterrupted wall space in the storage area. They built a new wall in front of the old door, installed paneling over it, and Linda Morrison's body had remained hidden for over 30 years. After the discovery, the voice stopped. We never heard it again. The Friday night call for help, the same phrase is repeated over and over. They just stopped. And nobody reported seeing the figure of the woman in the factory anymore. It was like finding her body had finally released her, allowed her to rest. The factory reopened after a few days, but it was never the same for me. I'd walk through that storage area, past the spot where Linda Morrison had been trapped and died, alone, and call for help that never came in time, and I'd feel sick. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd close my eyes and hear that voice, "Help me, please. Somebody help me." I'd see that figure walking through the aisles, looking for something she'd never find. I lasted another 2 months before I quit. I couldn't work there anymore. Couldn't walk those same routes. Couldn't work the same position that Linda Morrison had worked when she died. I got a job at a warehouse on the day shift, loading and unloading trucks. The pay is less, but I sleep better at night. I don't hear voices anymore. I don't see figures that aren't there. Sometimes I think about Linda Morrison and those 30 years her body spent in that closet, undiscovered, while her voice echoed through the factory calling for help. I think about how many people heard her over the years and dismissed it as just another quirk of the old building, just strange acoustics or pipes or their imagination. I think about how she died alone in the dark, trapped in a small space, knowing nobody was coming to save her. The factory is still operating. They have a new night shift crew now. I wonder if they know what happened there. I wonder if the company told them, or if it's just one more piece of history buried in the personnel files, classified and forgotten. I wonder if anyone ever thinks about Linda Morrison when they walk through that storage area, or if she's just another worker who passed through that place and left no lasting mark. I'll never work another night shift. I'll never work in another old building with a history I don't know, because I learned that sometimes the places we work, the places we think we know and understand, have secrets hidden in their walls. And sometimes those secrets don't stay buried. Sometimes they call out, asking for help, try to tell us what happened. And if we're smart, we listen. We pay attention. Because one day, we might be the ones who can finally bring them the help they've been asking for all along. I just wish someone had listened sooner. Maybe if they had, Linda Morrison's family wouldn't have spent 30 years wondering what happened to her. Maybe if they had, she wouldn't have spent 3 decades trapped in that closet, her voice echoing through the factory, calling for help that took 30 years to arrive. But nobody listened, not until it was far too late to do anything but recover her remains and finally let her rest. I listened, eventually, and I helped find her, but that doesn't make me feel better. It doesn't take away the nightmares or the guilt of knowing that I walked past that wall dozens of times, heard her voice, saw her figure, and didn't figure it out sooner. I did what I could in the end, but it wasn't soon enough. It's never soon enough.